Hi kids, it's Cinco de Mayo. Well, Cinco de Mayo is not a big holiday in Mexico. Okay, well, in Puebla it is, in Puebla, Mexico. But in Mexico it's not a huge holiday. But since we do know about it here in Southern California, I thought that we would go through it so you guys know. It is not Mexican Independence Day, so we'll start with that. So, Cinco de Mayo is not Mexican Independence Day. Now you're going to say, but, profe, no. El 16 de septiembre, the 16th of September is Mexican Independence Day. So that way you can fend off any arguments with your friends. So the 16 de septiembre is Mexican independence, and that is a huge deal in Mexico. Fireworks and the whole thing, holiday, and that is the cry of independence, and the Mexican president comes out to the balcony in Mexico City of the presidential palace that he doesn't live in but he works in, and he comes out to the balcony and he recreates that cry, and it's called the cry for freedom, Grito de Dolores, which literally is translated as the cry of pain. So the priest Hidalgo does that. All right, so let's get on to Cinco de Mayo. All right, the Cinco de Mayo is really the Battle of Puebla, so La Batalla de Pueblo. And it was fought against the French. And you're like, what? The French? Wait a minute, what's going on with that? Yeah, it was fought against the French. And it was fought here in the towns, well, a couple towns, but primarily in Puebla. And what the French were trying to do was they were trying to take over Mexico. And they tried to take over Mexico starting from the coastal cities, working their way in to Puebla, and then trying to capture Mexico City, which was the capital city. Okay? So the president at the time was Benito Juarez. He was president. He was an indigenous Zapotec Mexican. He was a democratic president, and he was a leader for about 8 years. Oops, I made a mistake there. If you speak Spanish, that's a pretty funny mistake. So in 1806 to 1872, that's when Benito Juarez was the president. And so the French were trying to take control of Mexico, and Mexico was extremely weak at this point in time, and the United States was involved in a civil war, so we were no help to our southern neighbors. So Mexico was on its own. And so what happened was we were busy trying to deal with our southern states trying to secede from the Union, and there was a huge civil war. Mexico was liberated from Spain. There were internal political takeovers in Mexico. There was the Mexican-American War that they had just gotten through, and Mexico was in debt. And they were in debt to various people. So the Civil War of Mexico impoverished them because they had so many battles on so many different fronts trying to liberate, and then they had internal conflicts and civil war, that they had borrowed money from France, Spain, the United States, and England. So they had all these debts to all these different countries. And so Benito Juarez suspended his payments on the debts. Okay, so he suspended those payments to France and the other countries of Spain, France, and England. And so that would have been okay. But in order to respond to France, England, and Spain, what happened was that Mexico, in order to pay the debts, Benito Juarez sent boats to, well, more or less what happened, well, hold on. So to explain it a little bit more clearly, so France, in order to respond to the debts, sent naval ships to Mexico to receive the monies. So France sent envoys, England sent envoys, Spain sent envoys and said, hey dudes, you got to pay your money. And so they had their discussions, and then Benito Juarez is like, we really don't have the money right now, or sent them along with some money or a contract and say, well, we don't have it now, we'll pay you later kind of thing. So England and Spain, they negotiated and they left. But France decided, hey, you know what? This is a great time to move in and collect on that debt, and then, ooh la la, we could take over the world because the United States is very busy. So, this gentleman here is not Napoleon, he's Napoleon III, okay? He is the nephew of Napoleon, the one that we always think of in the jacket and taking over all of Europe. And so he thought, well, you know what? Here's my opportunity to create a Mexican, like France and Mexico, and to have control over in the quote-unquote New World. So here you see Napoleon the First and the Second and the Third. Okay, so France wanted to extend its empire into Mexico. So Napoleon the Third sends his cousin Maximilian, who was German, because remember, the royal families of Europe are all interconnected by marriage. Even today, they're all interconnected some way, shape, or form. They are connected by marriage or blood in some way, shape, or form, because royal families intermarry. So this gentleman is a German, and he gets sent over to Mexico. And so what happens is eventually the French take over Mexico. Now, you're saying, but wait a minute. I never heard of this. I know, because that's why the Cinco de Mayo battle is so important. So, before I get to that interesting story. So, Maximilian gets sent over from Germany by his cousin, the French king, emperor, gets sent over to France, or gets sent over to Mexico, gets sent over to Mexico with his wife Carlota in order to govern France. Now, here's how their story ends. He ends up governing. They create these wide boulevards in Mexico City. They plant trees and parks and make it very European. They set up like this court. They create a palace that you can still visit today. But what ultimately happens is they only are there for 2 years, and that's it. And then he ends up being shot by firing squad by the Mexicans, and then she lives to a ripe old age of 92 or 93 years old, and she goes basically cuckoo, and she still thinks that he's coming back to visit her. So ultimately, the Mexicans throw out the French and by shooting Maximilian. So, but how does that happen? Well, the Cinco de Mayo battle, that's how all this stops. So, what happens is that the Cinco de Mayo battle is the first wave of the French invasion and the first time that the Mexicans stopped the French from invading. So France invaded Mexico in 1861 for the first time. So the French send the boats over, and they're going to try and collect their debt, but instead of collecting the debt, they have French soldiers. They're well equipped. The French soldiers are excellent. They've already taken over Europe once and created absolute havoc. If you know anything about history and Napoleon, he was a mastermind. So they are very, very well versed at war. Now, the United States at this point in time is in no position to help them. Remember that the United States, in all the wars combined, we had the most deaths in the Civil War because we are Americans fighting against Americans. So we are in no position to help the Mexicans at this point in time. So you have this incredible general, Charles Latreille de Lorraine, I'm sorry, French speakers, and he was fighting for France, and he comes over with, the guesstimates are about 6,500 soldiers. And so what happens is that his French army arrives in Veracruz, which is on the coast. So he arrives in Veracruz and he topples the fort at Veracruz. Then he goes along his merry way, having no problem, but then gets stopped at Puebla. There is a major battle at Puebla, and that is the Cinco de Mayo battle. So what happens is they are stopped at Puebla, and then the French have to retreat and have to go all the way back to France, rearm themselves, come back again, and then finally they do take over Mexico, but only for the 2 years. So this battle at Puebla is kind of a wake-up call to the Mexicans, also to kind of get their acts together, like, hey, listen, the French are really trying to take you over. And also to the French to say, hey, listen, the Mexicans, they're tough characters, don't underestimate them. So here you can see that the capital city, Mexico City, is right on its way from Puebla to Mexico City. So if you get past Puebla, then it's easy to overtake Mexico City. So you have a series of forts here at Veracruz, and then at Puebla, and then Mexico City. So what happens to deter the French army? So you can still visit the forts, Loreto and Guadalupe and Puebla and Veracruz. There are still forts there that you can visit today, and here are pictures of what they looked like, or what they do look like even today. And so you have the forts here. This is a depiction of the Cinco de Mayo battle. All right, so the Mexican army did not have a lot of money at this point in time, and they obviously had no money. And so Benito Juárez figured that he could round up about 1,500 to 2,000 men. Now remember, you've got 6,500 well-trained French soldiers coming on its way. So Benito Juárez encountered 1,500 to 2,000 men that were working on the farms. They were indigenous men. But remember, they have this Mexica background that, they are warriors in their spirit. And he has a General Zaragoza Seguin, and General Zaragoza is one of the generals. He is leader of the farmers. And then, although not a major strategic win, the overall war against the French, Zaragoza's success at Puebla represents a symbolic victory for the Mexican government, and it bolstered the resistance movement. Now, the Mexicans did have an army, and they were controlled by Coronel Porfirio Diaz. Now, Porfirio Diaz eventually goes on to be a president of Mexico, kind of like a dictator, though, but that's more about that later. So you have these two generals, and so they had a plan of attack. So what they thought they were going to do was they were going to create this kind of distraction, a two-pronged attack. So they knew that they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmanned. So what happened was they knew that they had about 4,500 Mexican soldiers against 6,500 French soldiers. So what happened was that the Mexicans worked with what they had. They had a battlefield that had lots and lots of mud. And so what they did was they put a bunch of cattle in front of them and the muddy conditions and worked with that. And they did a two-pronged attack. So they created a stampede, and then with the mud and the stampede, that created a disturbance and hit the flank, and then the professional soldiers marched in and then toppled the French army. So the French met their match and then turned tail and went back home. So they stopped the invasion of the French They were outmanned, outgunned, and you know, they're basically farmers, and they had the French retreat. So for about 2 years, the French went back, planned again, figured out how they were going to reman, sent a much larger force this next time, and then took control over and set Maximilian as a puppet dictator on the Mexican throne. And but that only again lasted 2 years. They shot Maximilian at firing squad, and then Mexico returned to kind of a democracy. Not really. Porfirio Diaz took over. So poor Maximilian was not was unfavorably disposed, and it ends in 1867. And the military assistance to expel the French was sent by the United States. So the United States sends troops, the United States sends money, because it wasn't a good idea to have a very strong French army at our back door. Cinco de Mayo honors the bravery and the victory of General Zaragoz's small outnumbered militia. So it's kind of this idea of the little guy against the big guy, and the little guy wins. It's kind of like David and Goliath, you know, outgunned, outmanned, yet the little guy still wins. So, you know, it's a hopeful tale. So Cinco de Mayo is a battle of, for me, a battle of hope, of the little guy over the big guy. So hopefully you can watch those videos that are embedded in your lesson today, and the ideas that you should be able to know is, what does Cinco de Mayo holiday commemorate? When is the Cinco de Mayo Independence Day? Or sorry, when is Cinco de Mayo? What is the difference between Mexican Independence Day? Who was the Mexican president at the time of Cinco de Mayo? Who were the Mexicans fighting against? Why did these people think they had the right to get into it with the Mexicans? Who were the 2 Mexican generals? And how many good guys, or how many good guys and bad guys were there? And what did the battle accomplish? And did this accomplishment actually last? So those are your questions that you would have to ask for a little quiz on this. I hope you have a happy Cinco de Mayo. Enjoy, and may the little guy triumph over the big guy.